So there you are. You heard from ADB about what they think about this topic. I'll call on stage Yurendra Basnett. He's the Principal Evaluation Specialist at the Independent Evaluation Department. He was also the team leader for a special theme chapter in this year's annual evaluation review, which talks about this country partnership. So I welcome you onto the stage, Yurendra.
Thank you very much, Saleha. Very good morning to you all. I just want to make sure colleagues at the back can hear me. Excellent, excellent. So you've heard from the experts at the front line why country engagement is so important. Perhaps I would like to start by my own personal experience having arrived in this beautiful city on Sunday. And I was just talking to Manny. The only word I could express was being completely awestruck, looking at the city. Growing up and reading about development economics, I had, of course, heard about the amazing transformation that this region had achieved, but seeing it in my own eyes was something extremely pleasant and awe-inspiring. And the topic, we couldn't have selected a better place to discuss this topic of partnership, country partnership, in my view, than this region that itself has, through reforms, has a legacy of delivering transformation. So you heard why country engagement is important. Allow me to maybe step back and perhaps discuss a bit on what is country partnership. If I can get this to work. I was able to get the treadmill in the gym work, but I'm not sure. Okay, excellent. Oh, what did I do? All right, sorry. Okay, excellent, it works. So, yesterday, we heard from Tim on the importance of definition and the importance of context. And country partnership strategy, or the partnership, is one of those things that's very hard to define. Where does it end? Where do you draw the boundary? Where does it start? So perhaps I thought I would start with a story, and he said that stories are quite important to tell not just the evidence and the lived experiences, but also to motivate the mind towards the evidence. And I recall joining ADB in 2015 and being a country economist in Papua New Guinea. One of the things that I quickly learned in the year was that there was a massive commodities downturn, and that had severely impacted the country. And we as ADB were in a constant dialogue with the government, talking to them on the necessary reforms. During that time, the government, while they were talking to us, they were not so keen on talking to other development partners, other multilateral financial institutions. And I remember during that time, having just joined ADB, my Director General of the Pacific Department, Jean Binba Yao, who was here yesterday, said to me, "You must carry the other development partners with you." And that is when I appreciated the importance of all the partners being around the table, not just one or two having a dialogue, but all the partners being around together and trying to find a solution. And for me, that is what I understood partnership and the country partnership strategy to mean. So I will return back to this theme on partnership, but for today I wanted to go through three key things, partly mentioned in the video by DDG Sona as well. The importance of country partnership strategy, factors affecting country engagement, and finally, what are the lessons that we learned in terms of how we can improve country partnership. Excellent. So before delving into the findings, a quick note on the evidence or the sources of evidence. My presentation is based on the 2024 Asian Evaluation Report that ADB's Independent Evaluation Department releases annually. this year's theme chapter focused on country engagement. We drew, and this is again what, to recall Tim's words, the importance of systematic review. We reviewed evidence through a country evaluation and tried to synthesize the key findings and lessons. But also importantly, because country partnership or the partnership is not static, it is constantly evolving, we went out and had interviews with country directors, the frontline ADB officials, as well as our counterparts in developing member countries. So, as I had mentioned earlier, the partnership sits between the developing member countries' own development priorities and ADB's corporate strategy. That is what ADB thinks it is best placed to add value. And finding that overlap is the key aspect of the country partnership strategy. And once you have identified, it operates as a platform to guide both ADB's operations, but also to articulate what are the future development assistance that MDBs like ADB and others can best offer to the developing member country. As part of our research, we also examined what you could term as good practices, if there are one, across multilateral development banks. This is not just ADB, but we also looked at practices at World Bank, African Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and so forth. And what we found was that effective consultation with the stakeholder is key to identifying that overlapping circle. And as it was mentioned in the video earlier, country diagnostic, because often in a strategy, what an MDB can offer are limited by the resources that are available. So a diagnostic is extremely important to pinpoint what is the constraint in the country around which the developing partner can be selective and be focused. And third, that we found in terms of good practice was learning. And this was mentioned yesterday as well. Of course, monitoring, tracking are important aspects to allow for learning to emerge, but learning is absolutely important, and also mid-course correction, because countries, again, operate in a dynamic environment. What was assumed at the time of undertaking the diagnostic, or what was assumed at the time of preparing the strategy, might not hold for the entire duration of the strategy implementation. So that dynamism requires us to undertake mid-course correction. Just earlier this year, I did the assessment, what we call country partnership strategy review validation for Fiji. And I see Eric over there, who was based in the country. In 2020, Fiji, of course, like the rest of the world, experienced COVID, and they had to take extreme and unprecedented measures to address the effects of the pandemic. And then it was followed by 2 tropical cyclones in the country. And we heard in the panel yesterday on ADF, this can have a devastating impact on a small island economy. Now, when that happens, you have to change course. But if you're learning and reviewing and assessing, it allows you to adapt. And just to close the story, what we saw was that the country program, the actual implementation and operation that ADB did adapt and was responsive, but the strategy was somehow not updated along with the country program. So in the report, we find 9 factors. I will not go through each one of them. Here I have, to even out, I have presented 8 factors. But just to pinpoint or flag a few things that I think are, many of them are well known to you, but few things that are quite important. I mentioned the need for being proactive and responsive. But what we found through the consultation was resident mission, that is MDB's offices in the country, their skills, their capacity, and their network are crucial in building the partnership and trust with the counterpart. And I think this came up in one of the videos as well. We know these networks or relationships many times operate on online chat platforms like WhatsApp or what have you. And over time, they solidify into a trustful relationship where you are troubleshooting and problem solving. A key challenge for a multilateral development bank is these relationships are not easily transferable from one staff to another. They have to be built. So how do you break that cycle, or how do you assure continuity is an important question or an issue. The second point that I wanted to add was value adding. Right? There are lots of things that a country does, and yesterday we had an amazing presentation from authorities from the Shanghai municipal government, and as well as from the Ministry of Finance on the budget work and then the assessment of the performance evaluation of the budget. So the government's own budget does a lot of things. How does an MDB add value is crucially important in determining the success of country engagement. So looking at the findings, we identified 4 key lessons in terms of, if you may, what works and what doesn't. So the first one was the need for country strategies or country partnership strategy to be customized to the individual needs of the DMCs. And again, I'd like to recall yesterday's discussion at the ADF on the small issues or challenges faced by small island developing states. But the customization is not just limited to those countries. Often what we see or what we observed when we were making this assessment was the CPS tends to be too generic. And one of the factors that we found was that it starts being focused because the country officers or the officials in the front line, they know what the country's issues are, what the country's priorities are. But as the strategy gets developed, you have additional agendas creeping in because everyone wants to see something that they feel important to be included. And before too long, it has become a very broad strategy that includes a lot of agendas, but perhaps loses the focus that it needs to be effective along the way. The second point that I would like to highlight, something that I had mentioned earlier, was that the strategy also needs to be alive, proactive, and purposeful. As I earlier mentioned the case of Fiji, we often see that these are developed, the strategies are developed, and then somehow forgotten during the course of implementation, because then we moved into doing projects, implementing projects and programs, but the strategy sits somewhere till the time comes for it to be reviewed and assessed and evaluated. And the usefulness of a strategy is only when it is being actively utilized. The second aspect that we've identified as a key lesson is that these strategies need to improve risk analysis. Again, during the course of yesterday's discussion, we heard the increasing risk, not least due to the changing climate, extreme weather events, and so forth. Just in Manila, there is now a tropical storm passing through, and I was up all night with my wife discussing how we're going to get the kids back on Zoom classes. So this is a reality that we face, and we need to have good country risk analysis that can inform the design, but as well as the implementation of the strategy. And importantly also, these need to be done or could be done jointly and in a collaborative way with the development partners and the government, so that we have a common assumption and understanding of what are the key risks facing the country. The third point that I wanted to highlight is that there is an increasing focus or demand for MDBs to leverage or catalyze private sector investments in the countries. And I don't want to go into the fiscal aspect, but we all know coming out of the COVID, many governments have a tightened budget constraint, and that means that they need private sector investments to increase. What we found was that the prospects for private sector investment in the developing member countries still remains constrained. There are many enabling issues relating to enabling conditions. But in our own operations, what we saw was that when we are able to draw linkages between what we call sovereign operations or operations with the government and our operations with the private sector, it can deliver greater, or it can help catalyze private sector investment. Often, or in many cases, what we observe is that our operations with the government, what we call sovereign operations, and our operations in the private sector tend to operate in parallel. And lastly, when we examined these country partnership strategies, we saw that the private sector development goal was not in the front and center. It was often included as either a mainstreaming item or something that was aspirational. So if this is going to be a central goal or mandate of MDBs, then we need to bring it to the center of the strategy's focus. And finally, there is, of course, we heard yesterday the importance of providing global and public goods. What we found, and of course, this is in the report we've highlighted, very few country strategies did engage in global and regional public good. But then, of course, we were evaluating or looking at evidence from country strategies of the past or the recent past. And this is an emerging agenda now, or at least has gained more importance now. So that in itself we thought was a finding. But interestingly, regional cooperation, and then for ADB at least, we have a very active regional cooperation engagement. The focus tended to be on infrastructure and less so on non-physical sectors that were key to developing or advancing regional and global public goods. And if I may add, even less so on reforms that are critical for advancing regional and global public goods. So we did highlight that the regional cooperation needs to also bring in to the center and have discussions around policy reforms that are needed to advance transboundary issues. So in the end, what I would like to re-emphasize is country partnership strategy is a platform between a multilateral development bank and developing member countries and the stakeholders. But it is first and foremost a partnership. And I think going from the last point, especially on global and regional public goods, if we are to achieve the goals or the aspirations that we've set out, I think the partnership is going to matter or be even more important because, again, as we discussed yesterday, these issues go beyond the borders, and there needs to be cooperation among developing member countries. Country partnership strategy operates best when it is providing a clear direction of travel, and for that, you need a customized strategy that is tailored to the country. It's like opening a map. You're in Shanghai, and if you open a map of another country, it will not lead you anywhere. You won't find the restaurant that you would like to go to. So the strategy has to be customized to the country that we are operating in. Risks have increased, and we need to have good risk analysis, and identifying these risks in a collaborative way. Private sector investment is key given the fiscal constraints, but that needs more integration or collaboration between how we operate in the sovereign space and the non-sovereign space, and again, the enabling conditions. And finally, I'd like to conclude by saying regional cooperation is going to be even more important, but we need to shift our focus from just the infrastructure to looking at non-physical sectors and particularly policy reforms around it. Thank you so much.
Right, so now we're all set for the panel discussion, and let me invite the panelists onto the stage right now. Um, in no particular order, we have Ajith Abeysekera, Director General, Department of External Resources, Sri Lanka. Safdar Parvez, Country Director, People's Republic of China, ADB's Resident Mission. Carmen Nonay, Director, Finance, Private Sector, Infrastructure and Sustainable Development, Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. And Prashanth Kotturi, Independent Evaluation Unit, Green Climate Fund. Welcome, Prashanth. And this very interesting session is going to be moderated by the DEC Chair of ADB, Justin Sikat. Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Saleha, and good morning, everyone. Thank you also, Yuri, for your presentation. And I'd like to congratulate you and your team. I'm sure a lot must have been done getting to this. Now, just a reminder for the audience, after this panel, we will be opening up to you so you can start thinking about your questions. And speaking of questions, so my academic and policy research background gets that in order for you to get the answer right, you have to really understand what the problem is. And that's in the case of country partnerships, we really need to understand the context of the country in order to be able to get the solutions right. So I will go to Mr. Ajith. The presentation showed that country partnership strategy provides a guide for multilateral development bank activities in a country and in support of developing member countries' development priorities. Yet, often these strategies are too broad or not focused. From your perspective, what steps can MDBs take to tailor their country partnership strategy to the specific circumstances and meet the requirements of the DMCs?
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I think it explained well about the idea of country partnership strategy. Because every country has their own visionary documents, and also the development partners have their own strategies. Then when both these things intersection, and then it creates country partnership strategy. But being Sri Lankan context, that I think that certain countries, they do have visionary documents, but it has not yet been articulated in a proper manner for programs and sub-policies and subsectors of the economy. So if we don't address our issues in a proper manner, because it is both aspects has to be considered from development partner side and also the country ownership of this country partnership strategy. If we don't have effective planning methodology, budgeting, and also if they don't have country diagnostic program on our own way, we may not able to pop up our needs of development, enabling them to better focus on the country partnership strategy. So, if Sri Lankan context, I would like to highlight that 2024-2028 country partnership strategy for ADB. Now, they now understood that first, because we hit the crisis in 2022, and then the 2022, they now understand the foster recovery is first, and then the build resilience, and then revive growth, because we need stability first, and then the focus on growth. So now it is better focused than any other country partnership studies, because just because of the crisis, we had our own diagnostic program, we had our own planning methodologies and reforms all came out of the screen just because of the crisis. Now we can have better focus. My point is that the country itself should need to focus to a certain extent, because we know that all our economics are a little bit political economy. So it's all sort of chemistry, but we should understand our problems very better way. And then from the multilateral development side, they can promote SDGs and global public goods, regional public goods, and so on, because they are masters in those subjects, and we may have little knowledge about those subjects. So if they put their inputs together, and then we can synthesize that and have a better country partnership strategy. And I think these are the concepts that we want, because we know that now multilateral development partners are now in a very comfortable situation because last 10 years they haven't had no substantial policies for climate change. Now it is being developed. Now they are better knowledge. They have better knowledge about that. So they can put that also. And my last point is now, normally we think about creditworthiness and poverty for a country to get concessional financing. But I think when we prepare the country partnership strategy, now Sri Lanka, because we are now having SOFA plus money, because we are a lower middle income country, earlier we were upper middle income country, but still we have climate vulnerability. So if the climate vulnerability is also, I think it needs to be factored into the concessional financing, because there are certain countries, they are upper middle, but still they are having vulnerability. So I think all these put together into this country partnership, then we can have better focus and better productive and proactive and purposeful country partnership strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ajith. And I also appreciate how you mentioned the need for the ownership and the focus. And I've been to Sri Lanka. I was there last year, and I saw the reforms that you are currently implementing right now with your new country partnership strategy. But also the climate vulnerability actually is very, very important in the discussions when you talk about country partnership strategies, especially and the dynamic and volatility nature of this world and the shocks. So Safdar, in light of this, of the intricate challenges confronting DMCs, it's essential to conduct thorough and regular country risk evaluations. This is crucial, recognizing potential barriers to MDB operations and for integrating evidence-driven strategies for resilience into our country programming initiatives. How can MDBs enhance the robustness of country risk assessments in the development and implementation of our country strategy?
Edie, Justin, thank you very much. That's an excellent question. I would like to just make 3 points. The first point is that I think we are living in a world where vulnerabilities of all kinds, climate vulnerability, debt vulnerability, economics instability, social exclusion, all kinds of vulnerabilities are on the rise. And so if there was ever a time to reconceptualize and re-emphasize the importance of conducting risk assessments, it really is now. And really, these risk assessments are critical not only for defining the scale and the scope of a country strategy document, how much to lend to a country, at what terms to lend to a country, but also to determine, the implementation success probabilities. They all depend upon conducting good quality risk assessments. So that's the first point. But the second point I would want to say is that risk assessments have to be, in some sense, rethought, because the kinds of risks that we are now seeing today are not amenable to the kind of traditional risk assessments that we have been doing, at least here in ADB. So, for example, the whole question of sovereign risk, because of high levels of debt, because of the slowdown in growth. So we used to take sovereign risk for granted, and that because there was a sovereign guarantee behind our lending, we didn't really care too much about it. Even now, we conduct sovereign risk assessments, but they are really sort of for in-house purposes. We don't reveal what is there in those sovereign risk assessments. But I think considering the kind of sort of debt trajectories that our countries are now facing, I think we need to be much more clear about sovereign risk issues, and we need to be much more upfront about conducting those assessments. The other kind of assessment that we have systematically not emphasized are political economy assessments. You see, development is inherently a political business. Even though we as MDBs claim that we are apolitical organizations, that doesn't mean that we should not understand the political risk associated with the implementation of our country partnership strategies. In which country which has unstable political conditions can you implement an MDB strategy successfully? Despite this understanding, there is a certain level of reticence in terms of conducting political economy assessments, because we fear that we would perhaps touch on issues which the government might find uncomfortable sometimes, or there are other sort of self-imposed barriers on conducting these assessments. So my sense is risk assessments, yes, but what kind of risk assessments we need to conduct, I think we really need to rethink, given the very different world that we are living in today. So that's the second point I want to make. The third point I want to make is the need for differentiation, the point that also came up in the presentation. We don't need to conduct the same assessments for all countries. We need to have an a priori determination of the kind of risk a country faces, And then we need to tailor those risk assessments appropriately. You see, I have been working on developing country strategies for pretty much most of my career in ADB, which is now over 20 years. What we have seen is that sometimes these risk assessments are not differentiated enough. Sometimes we conduct diagnostics and assessments which frankly are not needed. If there is a substantial, significant understanding of a country's economy, based on assessments done by another MDB or based on some assessment done by a private sector consultancy or a risk rating agency, we don't really need to recreate the wheel. So I am in favor of conducting assessments, but only when they confer real value and they tell us something new and they add to our existing body of understanding. I am totally against conducting assessments that basically duplicate and replicate what is already understood, because these assessments cost money, they cost time. I remember I was there was a time in ADB when it used to take 3 years to complete a country partnership strategy cycle. So basically, because there was all kinds of assessments that sometimes that were relevant, sometimes that were needed, sometimes that were not needed. So I was lucky, I went into ADB's policy and strategy department where I had an opportunity to reform or help the management reform the CPS cycle. And we brought this CPS processing cycle down to about 1 year from about 3 years. But now what I see also is that while the value of conducting good quality risk assessments is there is a lot of mission creep. And we seem to be going back to those days when it will be taking a much longer time to prepare a CPS. So basically, then, after you finish a CPS cycle, 2 years after that, you will already start writing a new CPS document. So where will be the time to implement the existing CPS? I think we have to be careful about the cost and benefits associated with some of these documents. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Safdar, and for articulating the changing nature of risk assessments, as well as differentiating the risk assessments that should be done for certain countries. I really appreciate your mention of the political economy, risk assessment necessity for some countries. That's where my research mostly is. But also the changing nature, especially with respect to vulnerabilities. And the most recent shock to the world was the COVID-19 pandemic. And Yuri made a reference to this earlier. We talk about limited fiscal space of government, what we call sovereign. But there is a large role now and potential for the private sector. So Carmen, let me ask you, findings from evaluations indicate that limitations in private sector development, a challenging business environment, and fragmented initiatives lacking robust policy support impede the success of private sector activities. These challenges encompass regulatory hurdles, high cost of doing business, poor governance structures, and inadequate financial systems. Could you provide some thoughts on integrating successful private sector development goals into the country partnership strategy? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to say that when everybody thinks about the World Bank, the natural thing is to think about the public sector. But in the World Bank group, there is 2 institutions that they concentrate on the private sector. So I want to tell you from the IEG point of view, the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank Group, what have we seen as 3 key findings when we have looked at integration of private sector development into country partnerships? And I was delighted to hear the presentation because it was all music to my ears. Everything that you were saying from ADB is what we're also seeing from the World Bank side, right? We might call it different. We don't call it CPS. We call it CPF, Country Program Frameworks. But the 3 key findings that we have are diagnostics, the importance of diagnostics, the importance of a comprehensive engagement, and the third one on the realism and political economy. Those are the 3 key findings that we have seen across the different either validations or evaluations of our work related to the private sector. So let me go into each of them and give you a small examples of some of the countries and what we have seen in some of the evaluations. On the diagnostics, we did recently an evaluation on the IFC country strategies and country private sector diagnostics. And what we found is that time was essential. And what do I mean by time? When we are seeing the country partnership framework, the CPF, if they're able to look at the different private sector angle for that country right before that CPF is engaged with the country, it makes a difference. If it's done too early or too late, it's very difficult for the private sector to be able to come in and have the enabling environment that is needed in the particular countries. So again, diagnostics, which is one thing that you pointed out in the presentation, is very, very important. We also saw that in a recent evaluation we did on the International Finance Corporation, IFC, additionality for middle-income countries. We saw how important was to bring the additionality angle to the diagnostic work of the country strategies of IFC in order to have more impactful transformation with the relevant countries. The second point on the comprehensive engagement, you have pointed at that as well. It's important to have the whole cycle, the upstream and the downstream. The importance of having the right enabling environment for the private sector at the upstream level to come into countries, and then the downstream. How do you provide access to services? And before my life in IG, I used to handle the water sector in the Middle East and North Africa, and I can tell you how important it was to have policy reforms for proper water resource management, let's say in Egypt, in Jordan, in addition to do the downstream work of bringing the water supply to the countries. So we're seeing that in many of our evaluations. We did recently one on the enabling environment for the private sector on climate action. We'll be talking about that, right? The global public good of climate change. But the importance of some of the core diagnostics that the World Bank is doing, there is one called the Country Climate Development Report, the CCDRs, and we point out from the IG point of view, the importance of bringing the private sector, the financing, to develop capital markets for climate action in these countries was lacking. And that's something that the World Bank needed to do in the CCDRs if they wanted to really bring private capital into climate change for the countries. And the last one, you have mentioned it, is the political economy. Not everything is the same in every country, but the importance of being able to be in the country to understand the partnership. And for example, we just did the country program evaluation for PNG and very clearly show how having boots on the ground, as you said, is very, very important in order to be able to bring the private sector to understand what is the political economy, what are the fragmentations, what are the pinch points that you need to help the countries to bring together. So these are the three key findings that we found from the private sector side on the evaluations that we have done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Carmen. Actually, it's very interesting as well, very similar to what was being discussed earlier. And I truly appreciate your mentioning the enabling environment to allow upstream work to lead to downstream work. In the Philippines also, we've been doing some upstream work, improving our public-private partnership, implementing rules and regulations to allow for downstream work. But you also mentioned, we know that there are challenges that cross borders. And this would largely be with climate change and with trade. And let me turn to Prashanth now. MDBs have been called on to focus more on providing global and regional public goods, including tackling climate change, preserving nature and biodiversity, as well as reducing risk. Could you outline the best approach, or what you think would be the best approach to incorporating the global and regional public goods agenda within the objectives of MDB's country partnership strategies?
Thank you, Justine. I'm going to take a bit more of a contrarian view to the panel here, because I'm going to be speaking from the climate finance point of view, because I come from GCF. And the world of climate finance is a bit of a different, slightly different, it's a slightly different animal when compared to the discussions around development. It tends to be much more political, quite often, as climate is political. But coming specifically to the point on public goods, right? Let me start by even trying to understand what a public good means, right? Generally, now I went through the publications of ADB, and quite a few other MDBs, because it's been quite some time since I heard the word public goods. And I'll come in a bit of time as to why that is the case. If you look at the strategies of a lot of MDBs, a public good is it's painted with a very broad brush. A public transport project is a public good. E-mobility project, right, for example, is a public good. A renewable energy project is a public good. In climate finance space, that tends to differ a bit. And there's no written definition anywhere in UNFCCC nor in GCF and all, but if you go to a sector expert in GCF and you tell them, hey, e-mobility project is a public good, right? Chances are they'll laugh out and then send me out of the room. They're like, Prashanth, you don't know what you're saying. So what is a public good in the climate finance space? What is a public good? A public good is an intervention, let's just say an e-mobility project. Why is that not a public good? Because the primary purpose of an e-mobility project is still to get goods and services from point A to point B. The fact that the emissions are being reduced is a co-benefit. Co-benefit is a term, by the way, which is used very widely in the climate finance space. So the public aspect of it is not front and center. Let me give you another example. Conservation of forests in Latin America, in Papua New Guinea, in Indonesia, those are global public goods because they act as carbon sinks. They have huge mitigation potential. You have had an entire generation of REDD+ initiatives which happened, in these parts of the world. Those are public goods. So that definition is out of the way. We spoke about debt quite a bit in this thing. That's the second dimension of why this differentiation of public goods, what public goods are concerned, why there's so much emphasis on not calling these other interventions public goods. Because if something is a public good, you don't borrow. Why are you expected to borrow as a country for something whose primary purpose is to serve global public good? You're first answerable to your own people and then to the rest of the world. But that's also a solution which I'll come to in a bit of a moment. Now, there are three characteristics that typically, in my experience at least, that go into working on a public good, right? These are not solutions, these are some observations. One is public goods, they do tend to take a long period of time to manifest, quite often, not always, but quite often. And you may not necessarily see them over one cycle of what you call CPS in ADB and others call CPF, etc. Second is because they take long time to manifest, it needs long-term engagement and it requires a certain kind of long-term financing which may or may not necessarily exist in terms of the instruments that MDBs offer today. By the way, I say all of these because I worked in an IFI before I worked in GCF. So I'm bringing perspectives from both the sides. Okay. Third is political will to stay engaged. Because quite often by nature of their intervention, public goods, global and regional public goods, because they take long to manifest, they also outlive the political life cycle in a country. Regime changes, you have government changes, you have different changes which happen in countries. So the political will to stay engaged on part of the development partner and the governments needs to be there. Which brings me to the question, are country programs even the primary modality through which we should be creating public goods? That's the question I would then throw out for all of you to ponder over, right? Or the country programs in the way that they exist now, a 5-year document, a 4-year document, should they even be the primary mode or the only mode through which we should be thinking about them? What is required to then bring about, if these are the problems, what may be some of the solutions? One would be long-term and assured investments through right kinds of instruments. And I think it was Yurendra who was mentioning earlier that by virtue of the capital raising structure, the kind of instruments that may be offered by MDBs may not quite often be limited, the breadth of instruments. But if you are working in public goods, there needs to be probably that much more openness to working through non-reimbursable instruments, grants, and those kinds of instruments which are not necessarily readily available quite often. And they depend on, certain definitions such as the level of income, for example, right? Per capita income, which has nothing to do with vulnerability of a country, which has nothing to do with the ability of a country to create global and regional public goods. That's one. Second, capacity building for long-term thinking in countries. I think in my experience, we have often used the word capacity a bit more loosely to say, the country doesn't have capacity. Oh, MDB doesn't have capacity, but maybe it needs to be a bit more focused to understand how do countries understand capacity and how do development partners think of capacity. Quite often, if you think on the development partners side, we say, oh, they're highly capacitated. What we actually, oftentimes what we end up meaning is that we speak the same language. Quite often. I don't know if any one of you here has worked in Bangladesh, for example. They have the local government engineering department, just to give an example from Asia. They know how to build roads. They are masters at doing it, So are we going to tell them that they don't know how to build roads? So the idea that there's this difference between how capacity is understood and at the country level and how capacity is understood at the development partner level. But what I'm getting to here is development partners need to build long-term capacity for long-term thinking. And here we have examples. I'll also give another example of how this is manifested, not in the climate space, but in a country, Indonesia. You have had, after the 1997 crisis, you have had basically this capacity and this consensus in the country to maintain macroeconomic stability. And since then, the country has been consistently, been adhering to that with institutions keeping that entire system in check. So that kind of thinking. Lastly, the other way that this could happen is tethering the countries to regional and global fora. Let me give another example. When it comes to trade policy, in Southeast Asia, ASEAN does play a big role as the platform for it. Another example, by the way, of something like that is Central America, surprisingly so. You have very strong regional fora. So if you tether yourself to those and the public goods discourse is brought onto those fora, no matter which government changes, you cannot unseat yourself from regional fora where you're deeply embedded, which then makes the discussion on public goods much more immune to your 5-year cycles of changes, whether at the development partner level or at the country level. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Wow, that's a lot to think about. It's all about definitions. Definitions of public goods, which I thought was simply non-rival in consumption, non-excludable. But it goes even beyond that. But thank you also for offering the solutions, possibly the solutions like with respect to regional fora. We have at ADB regional cooperation there across SASEC, Greater Mekong and CAREC as well. And the definitions and the also articulating grants, the importance of grants, since the nature of the definition for climate finance may not necessarily be the same as for MDB. So thank you so much for that. Now, I would like to open up, it's already 9:54, to the audience, if you have any questions. If not, okay, so there's one there at the back. From the Philippines. Please introduce yourself, thank you.
Yes, good morning everyone. I'm from the National Economic and Development Authority of the Philippines. So I think most of the other countries now are on its way to participate to the fourth global monitoring round of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. And since we're talking about enhancing country partnerships, my question is, and the GPEDC, advocates for the implementation of 4 internationally agreed principles of effective development cooperation on country ownership, focus on development results, inclusive partnerships, and transparency and mutual accountability. My question is, are these 4 principles considered in the evaluation or review of the country partnership strategies? And if they are, what have been the concrete mechanisms put in place to ensure discussions or commitments around these 4 principles to find its way into the preparation of the country partnership strategies? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Perhaps, Safdar, Carmen, would you?
I think it's more of an evaluation question, perhaps. Madam might wish to answer.
You want to come in?
If I may comment, the panelists also comment. So in Sri Lankan context, I think we introduced national evaluation policy in 2023 September, and up to that point we didn't have that much organized national evaluation policy. And now we initiated that, and step by step we increased the capacity building. And as you mentioned that if we take certain outcomes of the country evaluation and it will factor into the country partnership study, that is very worth, because in Sri Lankan context that we didn't have that much experience. But evaluation is also very much necessary because we are going on different country partnership cycles. But there should be a better mechanism to evaluate as to how we should achieve the expected goals of that country partnership strategy. In Sri Lanka, I think there are pluses and minuses both, because you know that the certain institutions warned about the economic crisis, but we have been engaged with many development agencies. But I think if development agencies just give some ideas about the impending crisis and all, that is very much recognized by a country like ours, and rather than the officials within the country. So therefore, there are some aspects of this, because better evaluation is also inbuilt in that proper initiative of this country partnership strategy. I think other panelists also can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Justin,
Carmen?
maybe just very quickly to respond to that question.
Okay,
thank you so much. From the evaluation side, absolutely, we do take those into account. Country ownership, mutual accountability, and so forth are key elements, not just from the design. So it actually starts from the identification of the country partnership strategy itself, through the implementation to the assessment and the evaluation of country programs.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please, Carmen.
So from our side, to complement that, because it's very similar. So there is two different things that we do on the World Bank Group side. Every 10 years or so, it's a country partnership framework, a CPF, and now is one World Bank Group. So before it used to be only for the bank, but now it's looking at the bank and also at the private sector, at the IFC and MIGA. So we come from the IEG side, and we evaluate that, and we look at the relevance, the efficiency, the efficacy, and we're seeing what is the country ownership. So it's very similar to what ADB is doing. And we look at it with the forward-looking point of view to see how can they learn from the experience of that CPF as they go into the next one. In addition, there is an interim product that the World Bank is producing. It's called the Completion Learning Review Report, and we do a validation of that. And they do it in between two CPFs. So we can and we validate it, and we take a stock, and we see, okay, was the program really designed and implemented what it was supposed to be doing? Was it really designed and implemented, and how well did the bank group do it in terms of the biggest strategy for the World Bank Group? So that's a little bit in a nutshell how we look at the country programs for the evaluation part of the World Bank Group. Yeah.
Thank you, Carmen. Any other questions from the floor?
Yeah.
Yes,
thank you. Good morning to everyone. My
introduce
name is
yourself?
Gambhir Bhatta. I used to be with the ADB before I took early retirement. A question to all four of you, and I guess it's sort of related to what my colleague Safdar has talked about, the political economy. It's probably easier said than done, because when you are actually in the country and you are dealing with issues that are very political in nature, take the example of Sheikh Hasina leaving Bangladesh now, or the situation in Myanmar, or the Maoist revolution in Nepal, for example. What's the capacity of multilateral institutions? And I include GCF in that as well, because you've talked about climate being a political concept in that sense. What's the capacity on the ground of people in agencies like ADB and the World Bank and so on to actually interact with the government and to engage with them, bringing in this notion of what's happening politically? And how do you actually, what's the space that you have to deal with a country with respect to what's happening there and how it impacts the portfolio that you have. And I ask this question because it is actually a very fundamental way in which multilateral institutions need to engage with government. So, because I do a lot of governance assessment work for the World Bank, for the ADB and the others, and this issue comes up again and again. It's easy to talk about it, but in reality, what's the difficulty, what's the space that you have in order to actually have a meaningful conversation? So I'll leave it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Safdar.
Okay, thank you very much, Gambhir. I think that's an excellent question. It's not easy. And if it were that easy, then everybody would be doing it already. So I think, let me give you one example. When I was in a different part of the bank, I was overall responsible for preparing the country strategy for Afghanistan. And you can imagine the political economy dynamics in a country like Afghanistan, war-torn, conflict-affected, whatnot. We realized that it's not just a question of capacity of local staff to undertake those assessments, it's also a question of the culture and the enabling environment in an institution to undertake those types of assessments. So in the case of Afghanistan, what we did was that we basically went to a very prominent a group that deals, that tries to understand crisis-related countries. We got some expertise from there. We paired that expertise with some people inside the institution, and I thought we produced a very good quality political economy assessment. Now, there are various ways of dealing with sensitivities. One is that if it is a really highly sensitive document, you don't necessarily need to put it on the internet, etc. You could have a more limited circulation of it. But I see no way, so if we really want to develop tailor-made country strategies without sort of a fundamental understanding of political economy, and you don't really need to put everything on paper either. That is why I think the strength of MDBs like us, which has a presence on the ground. We have a national staff. Most of the staff are national. They understand their own country. There are formal conversations. There are informal discussions. There are, non-papers that are prepared, etc. So there are many ways around which you can develop the kind of flexibility to think about these things, to have a dialogue around some of these issues, and to keep a discussion ongoing. And I think the other thing I want to say is that, let us not tie political economy type assessments to conducting a CPS. I think these assessments have a much broader value. They tend to inform not just a strategy, but they also tend to inform your overall engagement in the country. And we should just keep these things going on a more regular cycle depending on the situation in a country. The problem happens is that when you try to tie everything around a CPS document, the poor team leader has to undertake 20 assessments in 6 months. The result is shoddy quality work, which neither informs the country strategy, nor does it do anything for enhancing country engagement, and it certainly doesn't help build country ownership. I really like the point that our colleague from Sri Lanka made about country ownership. Even I think, Yurendra, in your presentation, the one thing that I think you missed out really is the value of developing country ownership of country partnership strategies. These are not MDB documents only. Their value is if a country really starts to own them. And I think if a country starts to own them, then they will also start to see value in these political economy assessments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Safdar. Carmen, please.
I think this is a great question, and there is no one-size-fits-all. So actually, my answer will be, it depends, right? I think the regions, that political economy is more important than others. And as I mentioned before, I worked in the MENA region before. I can tell you 80% of my time was political economy. You cannot do anything there without understanding the political economy. Also, there are countries that if they're in fragility state, it's more difficult for us to have people on the ground, but it's also more important for us to understand the political economy. So again, I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all, so it depends. But that being said, I think what is very important is, and here we're evaluators, that there is political economy and political economy. So there is a political economy when you're doing the CPS or the CPF as an operational staff, and there is a political economy when we do the evaluation of that CPS. And what do I mean by that? Let me give you the case of Morocco. I know it's not in Asia, but I was, again, in the Middle East, and I was part of the staff sitting in front of the government doing that partnership, that CPF. Then I come to IEG, and I see how my colleagues, thank goodness it wasn't in my department, so there was no conflict of interest, they were doing the evaluation of that CPA. And how we were writing it from the IEG point of view, sometimes we were missing the political economy because we don't have as evaluators people on the ground that we understand why there's certain things we cannot put in the document because it doesn't fit the political economy of that particular country, right? So what I'm trying to say is that there's political economy and political economy. But that being said, I think this is a great opportunity for us as NDBs to partner. I mean, the G20 have been calling upon us on, you know, in the famous paper on 2018, that we need to be partnering. And I think it's at that country level that we really need to be partnering together to understand from each other what is really the political economy, to see, okay, is ADB understanding the same political economy in Indonesia that the World Bank is understanding or somebody else, right? So I think there is an opportunity there, but we should not dismantle what is the importance. I mean, this is a great question, and I think super important, the political economy of what we do, and not so easy, as you said, yeah.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Prashanth also has something to add. Thank you.
Yeah. The usage of the word country ownership, I'll come at it from in the climate finance space. The way the word country ownership is understood is that country ownership is not the equivalent of government ownership. We equate, sure, government is a representative of it's a sovereign representative, you know, and of the country itself, but a country is made up of many, many other stakeholders as well. There's civil societies, there is national institutions, there's a whole set of stakeholders which also are crucial in programming at the national level and subnational level. And interestingly, this is why quite a bit of, when you look at climate finance and, you know, when you look at UNFCCC documents, in GCF documents, country ownership is made up of a lot of these other stakeholders as well. Interestingly, in 2022, we had done an evaluation, and I had led that evaluation on the direct access modality of GCF. Now, just to give a very brief perspective of what I'm talking about, GCF works with international organizations, so we finance projects with international organizations, UNDP, ADB, World Bank, AFDB, but we also work with national level institutions directly, so a land bank in Philippines, for example, right? What we found, uniformly so, and this was, we looked at the implementation documents and we undertook a mapping of over the years. What we found, and the sample size was a bit limited, but we also triangulated it with interviews. What we found was that in times of crises and chaos and disturbances, civil disturbances, direct access projects uniformly performed better compared to those implemented by international agencies. Even though the same documents are also saying that international organizations had better capacity. So we had developed some metrics and all, which we were using. But in times of crisis, it is the national organizations, national level organizations, which uniformly perform better. And when we speak to the same organizations which managed, which navigated these challenges, one of the things they said is that, look, in times of crises, policies, processes, standard operating procedures hold no meaning. What holds much more meaning is I pick up my phone, and I think Yurendra was saying that you write a WhatsApp message to the next person and say, hey, listen, you know, can you get this done, please, right? So that's what matters much more in those times of crises, in managing, in maneuvering those crises. And for all their presence on the ground over a long period of time, international organizations don't necessarily have that luxury as much as the national level organizations do. It seems, at least that's what it seemed to come out from our evaluation. They seem to be much more heavily embedded in the national systems, in the local networks, as compared to international organizations. So for us, the idea of country ownership probably needs to go a bit beyond government ownership, and it needs to encompass these wide range of actors. And I think that's the answer to also managing country level risks as they emerge. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prashanth. And that's actually another definition that we should be looking at. We've been talking a lot about definitions this morning. It's just up my alley. We have 10 minutes left. Are there still any questions from the audience? Oh, many. Oh, that's to DG Manny. Please. And then we'll do the gentleman at the back. DG Manny first, and then the gentleman at the back.
Hi, I'm Manny Jimenez from ADB. I was just wondering if the panel could reflect on the point that Prashanth raised about the consistency between our business model as to lend to countries with the aspiration to address global public goods. And particularly, I guess, Ajith and Safdar, do you sense that there's any appetite for borrowing hard money for these activities that really benefit others or the planet as a whole? And if not, what are some of the mechanisms we could, and maybe to Prashanth, what is the business model then that we have for climate finance if countries can't agree with each other on who is going to pay in the future?
Okay, thank you, Manny. A very profound question.
Okay, can I? Well, I think, Manny, that's a very good question, especially from the point of view of the issues that we are dealing with here in the People's Republic of China, where our program is almost entirely about global and regional public goods. Not and these are, generally speaking, pure public goods. We're talking about climate, we are talking about biodiversity, we are talking about the environment, we are talking about regional health security. So it's really, and I think our experience has been that when when the times are good, when the economic conditions are stable, when economies are growing, then I think it is a relatively not so complex to sell public good-based loans, and depending on the nature of the central and the provincial governments, their level of comprehension, the way they can relate their domestic agendas with global and regional public goods, there is appetite, and we have been able to sell many loans around global and regional public goods. But I have to say that in periods of economic downturn, when things start to slow down a little bit, particularly with the sort of higher sort of debt levels here now in China at the provincial and local government levels, I think there are now more fundamental questions, particularly around issues such as biodiversity. And we do feel that not everywhere, but in certain provincial governments, there is a degree of reluctance to borrow for pure public goods. What can we do about that? Well, I think one of the things we can do, which our colleague here also mentioned, is to look at the underlying sort of dynamics, not just the income level and income status of a country. I mean, if you can't make a case for extending some level of concessionality for pure public good projects, then where will you extend that argument? So this argument fits in perfectly well. I think the question is also then for our shareholders to see how they consider that argument, whether they accept that argument. Another point there, Manny, is this whole ADB's flagship agenda on the energy transition mechanism. Mm-hmm. Now, to sell that energy transition mechanism, which basically implies trying to get countries to go for premature retirement of coal-fired power plants, plants that have got a long life otherwise. So ADB has set up a fund really to sweeten that deal. We have gotten generous contributions from various donors. But really, that is really to facilitate this so-called just transition. So without the use of concessional funds, even in relatively high-income countries, I think it is very difficult to sell the concept of energy transition if you really don't have access to some level of grant or concessional resources to, for example, help laid-off workers from the coal industry, etc. So I think there are legitimate reasons why we need to look at blending of our lending and our financial resources in order to provide support for global and regional public goods. So I think we do need to go that extra mile, but there are ways, and we do have enough instruments in our toolkit to be able to make these global and regional public goods more palatable to these countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Safdar. I think Prashanth has.
So I'll just, I think Safdar has already, taken on the keyword that I was going to use, which was blending. Blending. Just to say that I think as coming from GCF, I think, and I was telling someone this yesterday, that GCF might be the only institution and GCF and the likes climate finance institutions, we have the luxury of still being able to write, checks of grants of $80, $100 million without thinking much, even today. And I think that is where probably the key lies, say for likes of MDBs, where the partnerships with climate finance institutions to enable that blending to happen might be the key to bringing about that change. But I'll also say this, based on our experience in evaluations, it's not always very smooth. In fact, just to also say that some of our most in GCF, and what at least I have noticed in my evaluations, is that GCF's relationship with MDBs is one of the more problematic relationships that we have. And it's a matter of, there's a saying that I heard, in one of my missions in Africa, which is that when two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. So it's the two elephants fighting, basically, the GCF and MDBs, each one with big egos. And then, in the end, what suffers is the countries, basically. So just to say that I think that relationship needs to be managed. I think that's much more key than just thinking about it in blending terms, because blending is inevitable, except that you need to figure out how to work together. So,
collaboration.
Yeah, collaboration, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Prashanth. Carmen?
So really quick, and I know we're talking about definitions, but in the World Bank group, many of you might know, we have just got into what we call an evolution in the past year or year and a half. And as a result, there is now what we call the Global Challenge programs, which I would say they're the global public goods. And there are different ones that are being structured as we speak. So there is one on climate, another one on digital development, on food security. And the idea is to bring both the public and the private sector and bring other partners as well. So hopefully that we have only one elephant and not two elephants, right? And as we're speaking, they're being developed. There is also one on water. They're being presented to the board. So it's a new way that the institution has realized we need to be working to have much more impact. That also means that some of the instruments that the institution was having, they're going to be taken to a different level. So it's not just the pure lending or just a grant, but for example, on the bank side, there is a product called the multi-programmatic approach, MPA, that is going to be one of the instruments for these global challenge programs. And on the IFC side, what they call the platforms. So what I'm saying is that there is a new way of thinking. I'm not sure that answers your question, Mani, that if on the receiving end of the countries, there is going to be demand for it, but at least there is a realization that we need to be working different, because the world has changed and we need to be getting more into this space and do it in collaboration with others.
Okay, thank you so much, Carmen. So we have just 2 minutes left before I ask for the final statements from our panelists. Is there anyone here else with any pressing, urgent question? If not, we'll just go straight into, I would like to ask the panelists to give their final remarks, please. Maybe we start with Prashanth first. Going back there, thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Justine. All I'll say is that working on climate is a global public good, and that's why at least GCF was formed. It was formed as a mechanism for solidarity among countries, and that counts for something. And if that means that we all have to work together, if institutions have to partner at the corporate level, at the country level to produce these global, regional public goods, then I think that is the way forward. And I think we need to change our thinking around, working together and not look at it in terms of processes, but look at it in terms of outcomes. What can be achieved instead of saying, will this fit with my process? So I will just stop there.
Outcomes.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Carmen, please.
Okay, I promise I didn't coordinate with him, but I was going to say that for me, the key word is partnerships, and it's at different levels, right? So first, at the country level, that's where the beneficiaries, the people that they need all of us the most are. So that's one level. The other level is between ourselves, the NDBs, and there is so much need out there that there is a space for everybody. So we should actually be all one elephant and not many. The private sector is super key, we know. The needs are there, and we need to do whatever we can to allow the private sector to be coming in and leverage them, because otherwise we're not going to be able to meet the SDGs and all the needs that are there. And last but not least, there are many other partners. There's the academia, there is the civil society, the NGOs, and they need to be part of the dialogue when we're doing the country partnership strategies or frameworks.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Safdar, please.
I'll just go back to what I said before. Go for judicious risk assessments that add new knowledge, avoid duplicative assessments, and avoid publishing reams of paper on things that are well known to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Safdar. Mr. Ajith, please.
Thank you. I think climate financing is the pivotal of all these, so it's very important. When we talk about country partnership strategies, as in the country context, we have to understand the texture and vibe of this, the formulation of this. And now we are having this COP28 type of organization, so all multilateral, bilateral partners sit together and discuss. And I think that as a country, we talk about the country partnership and also the government partnership, but it is a country partnership framework, so it's for the entire country. So therefore, the country must be able to get all good things from the development partners and the climate financing aspects, and they must be able to better focus on the development of their country. So for that, I think they need planning, budgeting, evaluation, all techniques. They must be smart enough for getting all these things into country partnership strategy, and also implement that in a proper manner, and also evaluate that in a way that they can learn something from that country partnership strategy. So if country goes like that, I think that the prosperity will be there. So now we are trying that, but earlier, so far, there are many decades, but we were not able to focus that much. But I think now we are focusing much more than earlier. So we think that we can better focus in a proper manner. So that is my point that I would like to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ajith. So I've been tasked to summarize this very rich discussion, which I don't think I'll be able to. But let me just bring it back to the country partnership strategy in light of all of what we've discussed today. Ultimately, the objective of country partnership should be to reduce poverty and impact development. In the case of the Philippines, this is what I expect of our country partnership strategy that I'm bringing to the ADB board tomorrow afternoon, which is why I have to leave after this panel. The Philippine CPS incorporates recommendations provided in IED's evaluation of the previous CPS, such as the need for stronger upstream, institutional and regulatory work, and downstream project and program linkages, enhancing climate action, and better integration of private sector into the country's development. My expectation of my country CPS was reflected in our discussions today, that country partnerships must be rooted in strong diagnostics, analytics, and now aligned definitions and dialogue to ensure that the partnership deliver the most impact to manage risks and shocks, but also create the case of dynamic inconsistency in this dynamic world. But also being innovative and creating new models and solutions came up in our discussions today. A new business model, perhaps, for MDBs, or more collaboration across MDBs and Global Challenge Fund. Development impact is no longer just the burden of the government, or as we call the sovereign, with shrinking fiscal space and tremendous development needs that in some cases crosses borders. Everyone must play their part. We need the private sector and cooperation and collaboration across the region and the world for maximum development impact. So thank you very much. So I think we'll have a photo op after this, yes. So with the panelists, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.